My father built Reynolds Construction from nothing. 3 generations later, I watched my own cousins escort me out of the building with a cardboard box in my hands. Today, that same company is struggling to survive while I sit in the CEO chair of their biggest rival. This is the story of how betrayal became my greatest motivation. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The smell of sawdust and concrete still takes me back to those Saturday mornings when I was 8 years old, following my grandfather Thomas Reynolds around construction sites in Phoenix. He'd started Reynolds Construction in 1962 with nothing but a pickup truck and a dream to build homes for working families. By the time I was old enough to understand what legacy meant, the company had grown into Arizona's 3rd largest residential construction firm. "Marcus," my grandfather would say, his weathered hands pointing toward another foundation being poured, "this business isn't just about building houses. It's about building futures. Every family that moves into one of our homes gets a piece of the American dream." Those words stuck with me through high school, through my construction management degree at Arizona State, and through every late night I spent learning the business from the ground up. My father, David Reynolds, had taken over from Grandpa in the early 2000s and expanded the company even further. We weren't just building single-family homes anymore. We were developing entire subdivisions, commercial properties, and luxury condos throughout the Southwest. By 2019, Reynolds Construction employed over 400 people and generated nearly $200 million in annual revenue. I started working summers at Reynolds when I was 16, not in some cushy office job, but swinging hammers and carrying materials alongside the crews. My father insisted I learn every aspect of the business, from reading blueprints to understanding zoning laws. "You want to lead these men someday," he'd tell me. "You better understand what they go through every day." After college, I officially joined the company as a project manager. I wasn't handed anything. I had to prove myself on every job site with every subcontractor and in every client meeting. The workers respected me because I'd been in the trenches with them. The clients trusted me because I delivered projects on time and under budget. Within 5 years, I'd worked my way up to Vice President of Operations. That's when things started getting complicated. My Uncle Robert, my father's younger brother, had always worked in the business but focused mainly on the financial side. His 2 sons, my cousins Bradley and Kevin, had joined the company around the same time I did, but their path looked very different from mine. While I was learning to read soil reports and managing construction schedules, they were spending their time in business school and talking about modernizing operations and maximizing shareholder value. The first real tension came in 2018 when we were bidding on a massive mixed-use development project in Scottsdale. I'd spent months building relationships with the developers, understanding their vision, and crafting a proposal that would showcase our capabilities while staying profitable. The night before the presentation, Bradley pulled me aside. "Marcus, Dad thinks we should bring in an outside consulting firm to handle this pitch," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "This is a $50 million project. We need to make sure we put our best foot forward." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Bradley, I've been working on this for 6 months. I know every detail of this project, every challenge we'll face, every opportunity to add value. Why would we bring in consultants who've never built anything?" "It's not personal," Kevin chimed in, appearing from around the corner. "It's just business. The consultants have presentation experience with projects this size." But it was personal. I could see it in their eyes, hear it in their voices. They were already positioning themselves as the strategic thinkers, while I was just the guy who got his hands dirty. We ended up winning the Scottsdale project, largely because I insisted on presenting the technical aspects myself, but the damage was done. The cousins had planted seeds of doubt about my role in the company's future. Over the next 2 years, I watched them systematically work to marginalize my influence. They convinced my father to hire expensive consultants for strategic planning sessions that somehow never included me. They started holding, quote, leadership meetings that discussed company direction without the person who actually ran day-to-day operations. Most frustrating of all, they began questioning every decision I made, no matter how successful the outcomes were. The breaking point came in March 2021. COVID had actually been good for our business. Everyone wanted to move out of apartments and into houses, and interest rates were at historic lows. We were busier than we'd ever been, with a backlog of projects stretching 18 months out. I was working 16-hour days trying to manage our existing projects while planning for expansion. That's when Bradley walked into my office with what he called a restructuring proposal. According to their plan, Reynolds Construction needed to, quote, professionalize its management structure and, quote, implement modern corporate governance practices. In plain English, they wanted to bring in an outside CEO while pushing me down to senior project manager, essentially the same role I'd held 5 years earlier. Marcus, you're incredible at what you do, Bradley said, spreading out organizational charts on my desk. But running a $200 million company requires different skills than managing construction sites. We need someone with corporate experience to take us to the next level. I stared at those charts, seeing my name in a little box reporting to someone I'd never met, while Bradley and Kevin's names appeared in prominent positions throughout the executive tier. And I suppose you too have these corporate skills? We've been preparing for this transition, Kevin replied smoothly. Our MBA programs, the consulting work we've done, the strategic planning initiatives, it's all been building toward this moment. That night, I drove out to one of our newest developments in Chandler. 43 families had already moved into homes I'd overseen from foundation to final inspection. Children were riding bikes on streets I'd helped design. Young couples were planting gardens in backyards I'd made sure had proper drainage and southern exposure. This wasn't just business to me. It was the continuation of everything my grandfather had built. I called my father when I got home. Dad, we need to talk about what Bradley and Kevin presented today. There was a long pause. Marcus, I've been thinking about succession planning for a while now. Maybe it's time to consider bringing in some outside expertise. Outside expertise? Dad, I've been running operations for 5 years. Revenue is up 40% since I took over project management. Client satisfaction scores are at an all-time high. What exactly are we trying to fix? It's not about fixing anything, son. It's about growth. Taking the company to places I never imagined when I started. But I could hear something else in his voice. Uncertainty, maybe even guilt. The cousins hadn't just been working on me, they'd been working on him too. Planting doubts about whether someone who'd grown up in the business could handle the complexities of modern corporate leadership. The final confrontation happened 3 weeks later during our quarterly board meeting. The board was really just family. My father, Uncle Robert, myself, and the cousins. But they'd prepared for this meeting like it was a hostile takeover. Bradley stood up with a PowerPoint presentation that looked like something from a Fortune 500 boardroom. As we look toward the future of Reynolds Construction, he began, we need to acknowledge that the construction industry is evolving rapidly. Technology, environmental regulations, financing structures, everything is becoming more complex. Slide after slide showed industry trends, competitor analyses, and growth projections. It was professionally done, I had to admit. But there was one thing missing from every chart and graph. Any acknowledgement of our actual performance over the past 5 years. The recommendation, Kevin concluded, is to transition to a professional management structure while maintaining family ownership. We bring in an experienced CEO from outside the industry while repositioning our current operations leadership into specialized roles. My father looked uncomfortable, but he nodded. It makes sense from a strategic perspective. Uncle Robert, who'd been quiet through most of the presentation, finally spoke up. Marcus, you've done great work, but this is about taking the company to the next level. Sometimes that means making difficult decisions. I looked around the room at these people I'd worked alongside for over a decade. So let me understand this correctly. You want to hire someone who's never built a house to run a construction company, while the person who's actually been running operations gets demoted? It's not a demotion, Bradley said quickly. It's specialization. You'd be chief operating officer, focused on what you do best. Reporting to someone who doesn't know the difference between a load-bearing wall and drywall? Marcus, my father said quietly, maybe you should take some time to think about this. Quote, but I could see the decision had already been made. They'd spent months preparing this presentation, months building consensus without me. I was just the last person to find out. 2 months later, they announced that Reynolds Construction had hired Jennifer Walsh as CEO. Walsh had spent 15 years in corporate finance and had most recently been CFO of a mid-sized manufacturing company. Her first initiative was implementing new operational efficiencies that basically meant questioning every decision I made while adding 3 layers of approval for routine project management tasks. The writing was on the wall, but I kept thinking I could make it work. This was my family's company, my grandfather's legacy. I couldn't just walk away. But Walsh made it clear from day one that she viewed me as an obstacle to modernizing the company. The end came on a Tuesday morning in November. Walsh called me into the conference room where Bradley and Kevin were waiting with human resources. "Marcus, we're restructuring the operations department," Walsh began. "We're bringing in a new VP of operations with experience in large-scale development projects." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "You're firing me?" "We're eliminating your current position," Bradley corrected. "There might be opportunities for you in project management, but at a different compensation level." That's when I realized what had really happened. This wasn't about professionalizing the company or improving operations. This was about the cousins positioning themselves to inherit control while pushing me out entirely. They'd used my father's legitimate concerns about succession planning to orchestrate a corporate coup. I cleaned out my office that afternoon, putting 15 years of work into 2 cardboard boxes. As I walked through the building my grandfather had bought in 1975, past the walls covered with photos of projects I'd managed, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to fight them for control of Reynolds Construction. I was going to build something better. The first thing I did after leaving Reynolds Construction was something I'd never done in my adult life. I took a vacation, not to some beach resort, but to drive through every major city in the Southwest, studying construction sites and talking to contractors. I needed to understand the competitive landscape from the outside looking in. What I discovered during those 3 weeks changed everything. Reynolds Construction, the company I'd thought was invincible, actually had significant weaknesses that I'd been too close to see. We were strong in residential development, but had never cracked the commercial market. Our technology systems were outdated compared to newer firms. Most importantly, we'd been coasting on relationships my father and grandfather had built, without developing the innovative approaches that emerging companies were using to win contracts. But there was something else I noticed during my travels. Apex Development Group kept showing up everywhere. In Denver, they were building a massive mixed-use complex. In Las Vegas, their name was on 3 different high-rise projects. In Albuquerque, they'd just won the contract for the new municipal airport expansion. Apex was Reynolds Construction's biggest competitor, but I'd never paid much attention to them because they focused on commercial and industrial projects while we concentrated on residential. That changed when I met Sarah Chen at a construction industry conference in San Antonio. Sarah was Apex's regional development director for the Southwest, and we struck up a conversation at the hotel bar after the day's sessions ended. "You're Marcus Reynolds," she said, extending her hand. "I've heard a lot about your work in Phoenix." "Former Marcus Reynolds of Reynolds Construction," I corrected. "I'm currently between opportunities." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Really? That's interesting timing. We've been looking to expand our residential division, but we've struggled to find someone with the right combination of operational experience and local market knowledge." What started as casual networking turned into a 4-hour conversation about construction trends, market opportunities, and business philosophy. Sarah was brilliant. She had an MBA from Wharton, but had spent 5 years working on job sites before moving into development. She understood both the financial side and the practical realities of construction in ways that reminded me of myself. "Marcus, can I be direct with you?" she asked as the bar was closing. "Apex has been trying to break into the Phoenix residential market for 3 years. We've got the capital, we've got the expertise in large-scale development, but we don't have the local relationships or the residential construction knowledge. Meanwhile, you've got 15 years of experience in exactly what we're missing. Are you offering me a job? I'm suggesting we explore whether there might be a mutually beneficial opportunity." 2 days later, I was on a plane to Denver to meet with Apex's executive team. The company's headquarters occupied 4 floors of a gleaming office tower downtown, and the difference from Reynolds Construction's cramped Phoenix offices was immediately apparent. Everything about Apex screamed success, from the reception area with its wall of awards to the conference rooms with their floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Rocky Mountains. The CEO, Michael Patterson, was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested he was always thinking 3 moves ahead. He'd founded Apex 12 years earlier after leaving a senior position at one of the country's largest construction firms. "Marcus, Sarah tells me you might be interested in helping us establish a stronger presence in residential development," Patterson said, getting straight to business. "Before we talk about specifics, I'd like to understand what you see as the biggest opportunities in that market." For the next hour, I walked them through everything I'd learned about residential construction in the Southwest, the demographic trends driving demand, the regulatory challenges that smaller companies couldn't navigate, the financing structures that made certain types of projects more profitable than others. I explained how the market was shifting toward mixed-use developments that combined residential, commercial, and retail spaces, exactly the kind of complex projects that required Apex's expertise in commercial construction. "Here's what I find interesting," Patterson said when I finished. "You're describing a market that plays perfectly to our strengths, but you're also identifying why we've struggled to enter it successfully. We've been approaching residential development like it was just smaller commercial projects, when really it requires a completely different approach to community planning, customer relations, and local government liaison." Sarah leaned forward. "Marcus, what would it take to build a residential division that could compete effectively in markets like Phoenix?" The question I'd been waiting for. You'd need someone who understands the entire residential development process, from land acquisition through homeowner move-in. Someone who has relationships with local subcontractors, suppliers, and municipal officials. And most importantly, someone who understands that residential construction isn't just about building structures, it's about creating communities. "Someone like you," Patterson said. "Someone exactly like me." The offer they made was beyond anything I'd imagined. Vice President of Residential Development for the entire Southwest region, reporting directly to Patterson. A salary that was 40% higher than what I'd been making at Reynolds Construction, plus equity participation that could be worth millions if we hit our growth targets. Most importantly, complete autonomy to build the residential division according to my vision. But the real attraction wasn't the money or the title. It was the resources. Apex had $500 million in available capital for new projects. They had relationships with major institutional investors who were actively seeking residential development opportunities. They had a legal team that specialized in complex zoning and regulatory issues. Everything I'd needed to grow Reynolds Construction but had never been able to access was sitting on the table in front of me. "There's one more thing," Patterson said as we wrapped up the meeting. "We've been monitoring several potential acquisition opportunities in residential construction. Companies that have good local market presence but lack the capital to scale up. If you joined us, evaluating and integrating those acquisitions would be part of your responsibility." I flew back to Phoenix that night with a job offer that would change my life and a head full of possibilities. But I also had a decision to make that went beyond career advancement. Taking this position wouldn't just mean competing with Reynolds Construction. It would mean systematically dismantling everything my family had built over 3 generations. The deciding factor came 2 weeks later when I ran into Tom Martinez at a Starbucks in Scottsdale. Tom had been Reynolds Construction's lead foreman for over 20 years, one of the most skilled craftsmen I'd ever worked with. He looked tired and frustrated in ways I'd never seen before. "Marcus, man, I'm glad I ran into you," he said, pulling up a chair. "Things have gotten crazy since you left. This new CEO doesn't understand how construction works. Yesterday she questioned why we needed to order materials 3 weeks before we planned to use them. She thinks we can run job sites like a just-in-time manufacturing plant." Tom went on to describe how Walsh had implemented new efficiency protocols that were actually making projects take longer and cost more. Experienced project managers were quitting because they couldn't get decisions approved without going through multiple layers of bureaucracy. Several long-term clients had started looking at other contractors because Reynolds was missing deadlines and going over budget. "The worst part is your cousins," Tom continued. "They're walking around like they own the place, making promises to clients about things they don't understand. Last week, Bradley told the Hernandez family that we could add a second story to their house design 2 days before we were supposed to break ground. When I explained that it would require completely new structural engineering, he acted like I was being difficult. I listened to Tom's frustrations and realized that my departure had created exactly the power vacuum I'd worried about. The people who understood construction were being marginalized, while the people making decisions had never built anything in their lives. Tom, hypothetically, if you had an opportunity to work for a company that valued your expertise and gave you the resources to do your best work, would you be interested? His eyes lit up. Are you starting your own company, Marcus? Something like that. 3 days later, I signed the contract with Apex Development Group. But before I started recruiting my old team, or planning our expansion into Phoenix, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. I spent my first month conducting a comprehensive analysis of the Southwest residential construction market, paying particular attention to Reynolds Construction's current position. What I found was both encouraging and sobering. The residential construction market in Arizona was growing faster than almost anywhere else in the country, driven by population migration from California and other high-cost states. But Reynolds Construction was actually losing market share, despite the overall growth. Their project completion times had increased by an average of 6 weeks. Customer satisfaction scores had dropped 15 points. Most telling of all, 3 of their biggest clients had quietly started soliciting bids from other contractors. The company my cousins thought they were modernizing was actually falling apart from the inside. Walsh's corporate efficiency initiatives were destroying the collaborative relationships that had made Reynolds Construction successful. The experienced workers who understood the company's standards and procedures were leaving for competitors who appreciated their expertise. But Reynolds Construction still had significant advantages: brand recognition, existing client relationships, and ongoing projects that would generate revenue for the next 18 months. They weren't going to collapse overnight, which meant I needed a strategy that would systematically erode their competitive position while building Apex's presence in the market. The plan I developed was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to compete directly with Reynolds Construction for the same projects, I would focus on the market segments they were neglecting. Mixed-use developments that combined residential and commercial space. Luxury custom homes for the growing population of high-net-worth individuals relocating to Arizona. Affordable housing projects that required navigating complex federal and state financing programs. Each of these segments played to Apex's strengths while targeting Reynolds Construction's weaknesses. More importantly, success in these areas would position us to eventually compete for the core residential development projects that Reynolds had always dominated. The first major test of this strategy came when the city of Phoenix announced a request for proposals for a new mixed-use development in the downtown area. The project would include 300 residential units, 50,000 square feet of retail space, and a 150-room hotel. It was exactly the kind of complex multi-phase development that Reynolds Construction had never attempted, but that Apex had successfully completed in other markets. I spent 6 weeks preparing our proposal, drawing on everything I'd learned about Phoenix's regulatory environment and community development priorities. The presentation I delivered to the City Council emphasized not just our technical capabilities, but our commitment to creating a development that would serve as a catalyst for downtown revitalization. When we won the contract, beating out 7 other firms, including 2 from out of state, I knew that our strategy was working. But more importantly, I knew that Reynolds Construction had received a message they couldn't ignore. Their former operations manager was back, and he was playing for a team with resources they couldn't match. The news that Reynolds Construction was for sale hit me like a physical blow. I'd spent 18 months systematically outmaneuvering them in the marketplace, but I'd never imagined they would actually put the company up for sale. My grandfather's legacy, my father's life's work, the foundation of everything I'd believed about family and business, all of it was now just another corporate transaction. Sarah's follow-up call an hour later provided the details that made the situation even more surreal. The investment bankers are Goldman Sachs. They're marketing it as a, quote, premier regional construction company with strong market position and growth potential. The asking price is $180 million. $180 million. For a company that had been generating $200 million in annual revenue just 2 years earlier, but was now struggling to maintain $150 million with declining margins. Either the family was delusional about the company's value, or they were desperate enough to accept whatever offer came in. There's something else, Sarah continued. Patterson wants to see you in Denver tomorrow morning. He wouldn't say why over the phone, but he sounded excited. I caught the first flight to Denver the next morning, my mind racing through possibilities. Apex had grown rapidly, but we weren't anywhere close to having $180 million available for acquisitions. Unless Patterson was thinking about something completely different than a traditional purchase. The meeting included Patterson, Sarah, and David Kim, Apex's chief financial officer. Patterson got straight to the point. Marcus, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. If you could acquire Reynolds Construction tomorrow, would you want to? The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished match. Would I want to own the company that had rejected me? Would I want to control the legacy that my cousins had tried to steal from me? Michael, that's not really the question, I said slowly. The question is whether acquiring Reynolds Construction makes strategic sense for Apex, regardless of my personal history. Fair enough. David, walk him through the analysis. David opened a thick folder filled with financial projections and market assessments. We've been modeling potential expansion strategies for the Southwest market, and Reynolds Construction keeps coming up as the logical acquisition target. They have brand recognition that would take us years to build organically. They have ongoing contracts worth $85 million. Most importantly, they have established relationships with municipal governments and major developers throughout Arizona. Sarah leaned forward. Marcus, from a pure business perspective, acquiring Reynolds Construction would make Apex the largest residential builder in Arizona overnight. We'd control about 35% of the market share, which would give us incredible leverage with suppliers and subcontractors. But there's a problem, Patterson said. We don't have $180 million in cash, and we can't get traditional acquisition financing for that amount without putting Apex's growth plans at risk. That's when David smiled and pulled out another set of documents. Unless we structure it as something other than a traditional cash purchase. The proposal they'd developed was brilliant in its complexity. Instead of buying Reynolds Construction outright, Apex would acquire 60% of the company through a combination of cash and Apex equity, while allowing the current owners to retain 40% ownership. The cash portion would be $75 million, still a substantial amount, but within Apex's financing capabilities. The remaining value would come from Apex stock, which would give the Reynolds family ongoing participation in the combined company's growth. The beauty of this structure, David explained, is that it's actually more valuable to the sellers than a straight cash deal, assuming our growth projections are accurate. Their 40% stake in the combined company could be worth $150 million within 5 years. Patterson looked directly at me. Marcus, this only works if you're comfortable with the family dynamics. Your father and uncle would become significant shareholders in Apex. Your cousins would likely remain involved in some capacity. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Bradley and Kevin, about their PowerPoint presentations and corporate efficiency initiatives. I thought about my father's uncertainty when they'd convinced him to bring in outside management. I thought about my Uncle Robert's quiet support for decisions that had pushed me out of the company. Michael, if we acquire Reynolds Construction, what happens to their current management team? Sarah answered. Jennifer Walsh's contract has a change of control clause that allows her to resign with a substantial severance package. Most external hires would probably leave voluntarily. The question is what role, if any, Bradley and Kevin would play in the combined organization. The irony was perfect. My cousins had orchestrated my removal from Reynolds Construction by arguing that the company needed professional management with corporate experience. Now that same argument could be used to justify their removal from the combined organization. Here's what I think, I said after a long pause. We make the acquisition offer, but we're clear about the management structure. I would be president of the Southwest Division, responsible for all residential construction operations in Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. The current Reynolds Construction management team would be evaluated based on their contribution to the combined organization's objectives. Patterson nodded. That sounds reasonable. David, what's our timeline for putting together the financing? Quote, 2 weeks for the initial offer, another month for due diligence and final terms. As I flew back to Phoenix that afternoon, I realized that everything had come full circle. 18 months earlier, I'd been fired from Reynolds Construction by people who thought I wasn't qualified to run a modern construction company. Now I was about to acquire that same company and reshape it according to my vision. The first step was assembling the acquisition team. Apex retained Morrison and Associates, a specialized investment banking firm that handled construction industry transactions. Our legal team included experts in corporate law, employment issues, and construction industry regulations. Most importantly, we brought in forensic accountants to analyze Reynolds Construction's financial position and identify any potential problems that weren't apparent from public information. What they discovered was worse than I'd expected. Reynolds Construction's financial situation had deteriorated significantly since I'd left. Project completion times had increased by an average of 30%, which meant they were tying up capital longer while paying penalties for late delivery. Customer satisfaction scores had dropped to the point where 3 major clients had terminated contracts early and hired other builders to complete their projects. Most damaging of all, Walsh's efficiency initiatives had actually increased costs rather than reducing them. The additional layers of approval and documentation required for routine decisions had slowed project timelines while adding administrative overhead. Several experienced project managers had quit rather than adapt to the new bureaucratic requirements, which meant current projects were being managed by less experienced personnel. "Marcus, they're burning cash at an unsustainable rate," David reported during one of our weekly acquisition meetings. "At their current trajectory, they'll violate their bank covenants within 6 months. The family might not have the luxury of waiting for the best offer. They might need to take whatever deal gets presented first." That intelligence changed our strategy completely. Instead of competing with other potential acquirers on price, we could focus on speed and certainty of execution. Our offer would be structured to close within 45 days, compared to the 90 to 120-day timelines that most strategic buyers would require. The formal offer went to Goldman Sachs on a Thursday morning in March. 60% acquisition at a $160 million valuation, with $70 million in cash and the remainder in Apex equity. Full employment guarantees for all current Reynolds Construction employees except executive-level management, whose positions would be evaluated during the integration process. Marcus Reynolds is president of Southwest Operations, reporting directly to Patterson. Goldman Sachs scheduled a presentation for the following Tuesday, where we would present our offer directly to the Reynolds family. I hadn't spoken to my father in over a year, and I hadn't seen Bradley or Kevin since the day they'd fired me. Now I was about to walk into a conference room and offer to buy their company. The meeting took place in Goldman Sachs' Phoenix office, a glass-walled conference room on the 25th floor with panoramic views of the city. My father looked older than I remembered, and there was something in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or just exhaustion. Uncle Robert sat beside him as quiet as ever. Bradley and Kevin flanked Walsh at the far end of the table, both of them trying to project confidence they clearly didn't feel. Patterson delivered the presentation with the kind of polished professionalism that reminded everyone in the room that Apex was now the dominant player in these negotiations. The financial terms, the strategic rationale, the integration timeline, everything was laid out with charts and projections that made our offer appear inevitable rather than optional. When Patterson finished, there was silence. Finally, my father spoke. "Marcus, I need to ask you something directly. Are you doing this because it makes good business sense, or because you want revenge?" The question I'd been dreading and anticipating for months. I looked around the table at these people who'd shaped my life in ways they probably didn't even understand. My father, who'd taught me about integrity and hard work. My uncle, who'd always been supportive until he wasn't. My cousins, who'd convinced themselves that corporate credentials mattered more than construction expertise. "Dad, I'm doing this because Reynolds Construction is exactly the kind of acquisition that will help Apex achieve our growth objectives in the Southwest market. The fact that you're willing to sell it suggests you've realized that the current management strategy isn't working." Bradley leaned forward. "Marcus, if we accept this offer, what happens to the people who've been running the company?" Quote, "The same thing that happened to me," I replied. "Their positions will be evaluated based on their contribution to the organization's success." The room went quiet again. Walsh shuffled through her papers, looking for something to say that might change the dynamic in the room. Uncle Robert stared out the window at the construction cranes dotting Phoenix's skyline. Kevin drummed his fingers on the table in a rhythm that suggested he was calculating something. Finally, my father looked up. "Goldman Sachs, what other offers have you received?" Mr. Reynolds, we've had expressions of interest from several parties, but Apex Development Group is the only firm that has submitted a formal offer with committed financing. How long do we have to respond? Patterson answered. We're hoping for a decision within 2 weeks. The faster we can move to closing, the better for everyone involved. My father nodded slowly. We'll need some time to discuss this as a family. As everyone gathered their materials and prepared to leave, my father approached me. Marcus, regardless of how this turns out, I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished. I made some mistakes when you were at Reynolds Construction. I should have listened to you more and trusted your judgment. It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get, and maybe the closest thing to reconciliation that was possible after everything that had happened. Dad, I understand why you made the decisions you did. You were trying to do what was best for the company and the family. Sometimes that's harder than it should be. A week later, Goldman Sachs called with the answer that would change everything. Reynolds Construction accepted our offer. The closing took place on a Thursday morning in May, exactly 18 months after I'd been escorted out of Reynolds Construction with my belongings in cardboard boxes. This time I walked into the same building as the president of Southwest Operations for the largest residential construction company in Arizona. The first order of business was addressing the management transition. Jennifer Walsh had already submitted her resignation, citing the change of control provision in her contract. Her departure came with a $1.2 million severance package, but it also eliminated the biggest obstacle to integrating Reynolds Construction into Apex's operational structure. Bradley and Kevin's situation was more delicate. Technically, they were still family members and now shareholders in the combined company. But their roles as vice presidents of strategic development had become redundant once Apex's corporate structure was implemented. Patterson handled their transition with diplomatic precision. Bradley, Kevin, we value the strategic thinking you've brought to Reynolds Construction, he said during our first leadership meeting. However, the combined organization has different operational requirements. We'd like to offer you positions as regional development consultants, focused on identifying new market opportunities throughout the Southwest. It was a face-saving title that removed them from day-to-day operations while keeping them technically employed. The positions came with modest salaries and office space, but no real authority over construction projects or personnel decisions. Bradley accepted immediately, probably recognizing that any alternative would be worse. Kevin took 3 days to respond, but eventually agreed to the new arrangement. The real work began with integrating two companies that had very different operational philosophies. Reynolds Construction had developed a culture of careful deliberation and consensus building, reflecting my grandfather's belief that construction decisions should never be rushed. Apex, on the other hand, operated with the kind of aggressive efficiency that came from competing in markets where speed and adaptability determine success. My first major decision was reorganizing the project management structure. Instead of having separate teams for residential and commercial projects, I created integrated divisions based on geographic markets. Each division would handle all types of construction within their territory, which allowed us to leverage relationships with local subcontractors and suppliers more effectively. The change wasn't popular with everyone. Some of the Reynolds Construction veterans worried that the company's attention to craftsmanship would be sacrificed for Apex's growth objectives. I addressed their concerns during a company-wide meeting held in the warehouse where my grandfather had once stored his first batch of construction materials. I know some of you are worried about what this acquisition means for the way we build homes, I said, looking out at faces I'd worked alongside for over a decade. Let me be clear about something. The reason Apex wanted to acquire Reynolds Construction wasn't to change how you do your jobs. It was because of how well you do your jobs. Our objective is giving you the resources to do even better work. To demonstrate that commitment, one of my first initiatives was upgrading Reynolds Construction's equipment and technology systems. We replaced their aging fleet of trucks with new vehicles equipped with GPS tracking and digital communication systems. Every project manager received tablets loaded with construction management software that could track progress, manage schedules, and communicate with subcontractors in real time. The technology upgrades were expensive, over $3 million in the first 6 months, but they immediately improved our operational efficiency. Project completion times decreased by an average of 2 weeks, while customer satisfaction scores increased to levels higher than Reynolds Construction had achieved before my departure. More importantly, the improved systems allowed us to take on larger and more complex projects. When the Arizona Department of Transportation announced a contract for building highway maintenance facilities throughout the state, we were able to submit a competitive bid that leveraged both Apex's commercial construction expertise and Reynolds Construction's local market knowledge. Winning the DOT contract was a breakthrough moment that demonstrated the strategic value of the acquisition. The $45 million project required coordinating construction across 12 different sites, managing complex regulatory requirements, and working with specialized subcontractors who rarely handled residential work. It was exactly the kind of challenge that neither company could have tackled independently. But the real validation of our integration strategy came from an unexpected source: our competitors' responses to the combined company's market position. Within 6 months of the acquisition, 3 out-of-state construction firms had announced plans to establish operations in Arizona, specifically citing the need to compete with, quote, the new market leader in residential construction. Their concerns were justified. The combined Apex Reynolds organization controlled approximately 35% of Arizona's residential construction market, with additional significant positions in Nevada and New Mexico. We had the financial resources to compete for any project, the operational expertise to handle complex developments, and the local relationships to navigate regulatory challenges that stymied outside competitors. The growth numbers told the story better than any strategic analysis. In our first full year after the acquisition, the combined company completed $280 million in projects, compared to Reynolds Construction's $150 million the previous year. Our profit margins improved from 8% to 12%, primarily because of operational efficiencies and our ability to negotiate better terms with suppliers. But success brought its own challenges, particularly in managing the relationship between my father and the expanded company operations. As a 40% shareholder, he retained significant influence over strategic decisions, but his understanding of construction industry trends hadn't kept pace with the rapid changes we were implementing. The tension came to a head during our quarterly board meeting in December, when my father questioned the wisdom of expanding into commercial construction markets outside Arizona. Marcus, I understand the financial projections, but Reynolds Construction built its reputation by focusing on what we do best: residential construction in markets where we understand the local dynamics. Are we risking that reputation by chasing projects in industries where we don't have proven expertise? It was a fair question that reflected legitimate concerns about overextension. But it also revealed the fundamental difference in perspective between someone who'd built a successful regional company and someone who was trying to create a multi-state construction empire. Dad, the construction industry is consolidating rapidly. Companies that don't grow are going to be acquired by companies that do. We can either be the acquirer or the acquired, but we can't stay the same size and expect to remain competitive. Patterson supported my position with market data showing how construction companies across the Southwest were being absorbed by larger regional and national firms. The choice wasn't between growth and stability. It was between controlled growth and eventual irrelevance. My father listened to the presentation with the same careful attention he'd always given to complex problems. When Patterson finished, he nodded slowly. I suppose every generation has to adapt to the business environment they inherit. Your grandfather adapted to post-war suburban development. I adapted to environmental regulations and building codes. Now you're adapting to industry consolidation and national competition. The principles are the same, I replied. Build quality projects, treat people fairly, and always deliver what you promise. Everything else is just tactics. 6 months later, we announced our next major acquisition, Sunrise Construction, a commercial builder based in Albuquerque with expertise in educational and medical facilities. The $25 million purchase gave us immediate access to New Mexico's institutional construction market and demonstrated our ability to expand beyond traditional residential development. The Sunrise acquisition also marked a personal milestone that I hadn't anticipated when this journey began. For the first time since leaving Reynolds Construction, I felt like I was building something new rather than competing with something old. The company we'd created through strategic acquisitions and operational improvements was fundamentally different from either Apex or Reynolds Construction had been individually. That realization became clear during a site visit to our largest current project, a 500-unit residential community in Henderson, Nevada, that incorporated sustainable building practices, smart home technology, and commercial amenities that would serve the surrounding neighborhood. The project required coordination between teams that had originally worked for 3 different companies, using construction techniques that none of us had attempted 5 years earlier. Standing in the sales center, looking out at foundations being poured for homes that would house families for decades, I understood what my grandfather had meant about building futures rather than just houses. But I also understood something he probably couldn't have imagined, that building futures in the modern construction industry required the kind of resources and capabilities that only came from thinking beyond traditional boundaries. The final piece of the story came full circle when Bradley approached me after our annual shareholder meeting in March. He'd spent the previous year working as a regional development consultant, a role that had given him first-hand exposure to how the combined company actually operated. "Marcus, I owe you an apology," he said in a conversation I'd never expected to have. "When we brought in Jennifer Walsh and restructured the company, we thought we were modernizing operations. We didn't understand that we were actually destroying the relationships and expertise that made Reynolds Construction successful. Bradley, you were trying to solve real problems. The company did need to grow and adapt to changing market conditions. The mistake wasn't recognizing those challenges. It was thinking that corporate management techniques could replace construction industry experience. I've learned more about construction in the past year than I did in the previous 5. Watching how you've integrated the companies, seeing the results we're achieving, it's clear that industry expertise has to come first, and everything else builds from there." Today, as I write this story, Apex Development Group operates in 6 states, with annual revenue approaching $500 million. We employ over 1,200 people and have active projects ranging from affordable housing developments to luxury resorts. The company my cousins thought needed outside management to reach the next level has grown into something none of us could have imagined when this journey began. But the most satisfying part isn't the financial success or the industry recognition. It's knowing that we've created something that honors the best traditions of family business while adapting to the realities of modern competition. Every home we build, every community we develop, every family that moves into one of our projects is a continuation of the legacy my grandfather started 60 years ago. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting better. 3 years after the Reynolds Construction acquisition, I found myself standing in the exact same conference room where my cousins had fired me, but everything had changed. The walls now displayed awards from the National Association of Home Builders, photos of completed projects across 6 states, and a timeline showing Apex Development Group's evolution from a regional commercial builder to the Southwest's largest integrated construction company. The meeting that day wasn't about restructuring or efficiency protocols. It was about announcing our most ambitious project yet, a $2.3 billion master plan community outside Phoenix that would house 15,000 families and include schools, shopping centers, medical facilities, and recreational amenities. The Meridian Hills development would take 12 years to complete and represent the largest private residential construction project in Arizona history. This project embodies everything we've learned about community development over the past decade, I told the assembled team of architects, engineers, and municipal officials. We're not just building houses, we're creating a prototype for sustainable suburban living in the 21st century. The irony wasn't lost on me. 4 years earlier, Bradley and Kevin had argued that I lacked the vision to lead a modern construction company. Now I was presenting a development plan that would reshape how Arizona communities were designed and built for the next generation. But the path to Meridian Hills had required navigating challenges that went far beyond construction logistics. The most significant was managing the complex family dynamics that had emerged as Apex grew, from a $500 million company to a $1.2 billion enterprise. My father's 40% ownership stake meant that every major strategic decision required his approval, and his perspective on risk management often conflicted with the aggressive growth strategies that had driven our success. The tension reached its peak during negotiations for our seventh acquisition, Coastal Construction, a California-based firm specializing in high-end resort developments. The $85 million purchase would give us immediate access to Southern California's luxury hospitality market, but it also represented our largest acquisition and our first expansion outside the Southwest. "Marcus, I understand the strategic rationale," my father said during the board meeting where we discussed the Coastal deal. "But we're talking about entering a market where we have no existing relationships, competing against established firms that have been building luxury properties for decades. Are we overreaching?" It was a conversation that reflected deeper questions about the company's identity and direction. My father had built Reynolds Construction by focusing intensively on residential development in markets where the family had deep roots and long-standing relationships. The approach I was advocating involved competing nationally in multiple market segments, using acquisition and strategic partnerships to accelerate growth. "Dad, the luxury hospitality market is experiencing unprecedented demand, especially for sustainable resort developments that cater to environmentally conscious travelers. Coastal Construction has completed 4 LEED-certified resort projects in the past 3 years. Their expertise in environmental construction, combined with our financial resources and operational capabilities, would make us the only builder on the West Coast capable of handling large-scale, sustainable hospitality projects." Patterson supported the acquisition with detailed financial projections showing how Coastal Construction's specialized expertise would open opportunities worth potentially $500 million over the next 5 years. More importantly, the luxury hospitality market offered profit margins significantly higher than traditional residential construction. The debate continued for 2 hours, with Sarah Chen presenting competitive analyses and David Kim walking through various financing scenarios. But I could see that my father's concerns weren't really about financial projections or market opportunities. They were about whether the company we were building bore any resemblance to the one his father had founded. Finally, Uncle Robert spoke up, the first time he'd contributed to one of these strategic discussions in over a year. "David, when you started Reynolds Construction, the construction industry was completely different. Projects were smaller, financing was simpler, and most builders served local markets. The industry Marcus is competing in today requires resources and capabilities that didn't exist when we were learning the business." He turned to face my father directly. "We can either adapt to the modern construction industry or watch other companies acquire our market share, but we can't pretend that the strategies that worked 30 years ago will be sufficient today." My father listened to his brother with the same careful attention he'd always given to complex decisions. When Uncle Robert finished, he was quiet for several minutes, studying the acquisition documents spread across the conference table. "Marcus, if we approve this acquisition, what safeguards do we have to ensure that Coastal Construction's project quality meets our standards?" It was the question I'd been waiting for, the signal that he was moving from opposition to conditional approval. "We retain all of Coastal's key personnel, including their project managers and quality control supervisors. Every project would be subject to the same inspection protocols we use for all Apex developments. Most importantly, I would personally oversee the integration process and ensure that their construction practices align with our quality standards. And if the integration doesn't work, if we discover that their operational culture isn't compatible with our approach, then we adjust their management structure and implement our operational procedures. The worst-case scenario is that we've acquired $85 million worth of assets and expertise in a high-growth market segment." The vote was unanimous, but I knew that my father's approval came with unspoken expectations about how the acquisition would be managed. This wasn't just a business transaction. It was a test of whether my vision for the company's future could succeed without compromising the values that had made Reynolds Construction successful. The Coastal Construction integration became the most complex challenge I'd faced since joining Apex. Unlike our previous acquisitions, which had involved companies with similar operational approaches, Coastal had developed distinctive project management techniques specifically for luxury hospitality construction. Their methods emphasized customization and client collaboration in ways that sometimes conflicted with Apex's efficiency-focused procedures. The breakthrough came when I realized that instead of imposing our systems on Coastal, we needed to learn from their approach and adapt it to other market segments. Their techniques for managing complex stakeholder relationships, coordinating between resort owners, hospitality operators, environmental consultants, and local communities, were directly applicable to large-scale residential developments like Meridian Hills. Marcus, what Coastal does really well is stakeholder engagement, explained Rebecca Martinez, Coastal's former president who had become our vice president of luxury development. They understand that high-end construction projects aren't just about building structures, they're about creating experiences that meet or exceed very sophisticated expectations. That insight transformed how we approached the Meridian Hills project. Instead of developing the community according to conventional suburban planning principles, we engaged directly with potential residents, local businesses, and municipal officials to understand what kind of community would best serve the evolving needs of Arizona families. The process took 18 months and included focus groups with young professionals, families with children, and retirees who were considering relocating to Arizona. We surveyed local businesses about what commercial amenities would best serve a master-planned community. We worked with school districts to design educational facilities that could adapt to changing educational technologies. Most importantly, we collaborated with environmental scientists to ensure that Meridian Hills would actually improve the desert ecosystem rather than simply minimizing environmental damage. The development would include native plant restoration, renewable energy systems, and water conservation technologies that would make it a model for sustainable community development throughout the Southwest. The comprehensive planning process added $15 million to the project's upfront costs, but it also generated a level of community support and media attention that traditional developments rarely achieved. When we officially announced Meridian Hills at a press conference attended by Arizona's governor and Phoenix's mayor, the project was immediately recognized as a landmark achievement in sustainable suburban development. Meridian Hills represents the future of community development in Arizona, Governor Jennifer Walsh, no relation to the former Reynolds Construction CEO, said during her remarks. This project demonstrates that economic growth and environmental responsibility aren't competing objectives. They're complementary approaches to building communities that will thrive for generations. The validation from state and local officials was gratifying, but the real measure of success came from the market response. Within 6 months of announcing the project, we had pre-sold 1,200 homes to buyers who were willing to wait 3 years for construction to begin. The average sale price was 20% higher than comparable properties in the Phoenix area, reflecting the premium that buyers were willing to pay for innovative community design and environmental sustainability. But Meridian Hills represented more than just financial success. It demonstrated that the company we'd built through strategic acquisitions and operational improvements could tackle challenges that no single firm could have handled independently. The project required expertise in sustainable construction, luxury residential development, commercial property design, and municipal infrastructure planning. Each of these capabilities had come from different acquisitions and partnerships we'd developed over the previous 5 years. The personal vindication came during the groundbreaking ceremony for Meridian Hills, when my father approached me after the formal presentations had concluded. Marcus, I owe you an acknowledgement that I should have made years ago. When you first started talking about transforming Apex into a multi-state construction company, I thought you were being overly ambitious. I was wrong. He paused, looking out at the desert landscape where construction crews were beginning site preparation for the first phase of homes. Your grandfather built Reynolds Construction by adapting to the opportunities and challenges of his era. You've built something much larger by adapting to the opportunities and challenges of your era. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, and I'm grateful that you found a way to honor the family legacy while creating something entirely new. It was the conversation we should have had 5 years earlier, but the timing felt right. We'd both learned things about leadership, family, and business that could only come from navigating the complex challenges of building something significant. The story reached its final chapter 6 months later, when Bradley approached me with a proposal that nobody could have predicted when this journey began. Marcus, I've been thinking about something for a while, and I wanted to run it by you before I discuss it with anyone else. Kevin and I have been working as development consultants for 3 years now, and we've learned more about construction than we ever understood when we were trying to run Reynolds Construction. We think we're ready to take on real operational responsibilities again. I was intrigued but cautious. Bradley and Kevin had certainly gained experience and perspective during their time as consultants, but they'd also been responsible for the decisions that had nearly destroyed Reynolds Construction. What kind of operational responsibilities are you thinking about? We'd like to establish and run Apex's Sustainable Development Division. Focus specifically on environmentally innovative projects like Meridian Hills. We've spent the past year studying sustainable construction techniques, and we think there's a significant market opportunity that we're uniquely positioned to pursue. The proposal was actually brilliant. Bradley and Kevin had developed genuine expertise in sustainable development planning during their consulting work, and the market for environmentally innovative construction was growing rapidly. More importantly, giving them operational responsibility for a specialized division would allow them to contribute meaningfully to the company's success, while working in an area where their strategic thinking skills were actually valuable. What would this division look like organizationally? A semi-autonomous unit within Apex, focused exclusively on sustainable residential and commercial projects. We'd handle project development and client relations, while working with your existing construction teams for actual building operations. Think of it as the reverse of what we tried to do at Reynolds Construction. Instead of strategic people trying to manage operations, we'd be strategic people supporting operational expertise. I discussed the proposal with Patterson and Sarah, both of whom thought it made sense as a way to expand into the growing sustainable construction market while addressing the family dynamic issues that had persisted since the Reynolds acquisition. Marcus, this could actually work well for everyone, Sarah pointed out. Bradley and Kevin get to run something significant, you get to focus on the core construction operations, and the company gets to pursue a high-growth market segment without diverting resources from existing projects. 3 months later, we announced the formation of Apex Sustainable Development, with Bradley as president and Kevin as vice president of project development. Their first project was a 200-unit affordable housing development in Tucson that would incorporate solar energy, water recycling, and energy-efficient building materials, while maintaining construction costs comparable to conventional development. Today, as I reflect on this journey from the CEO office of what has become the Southwest's largest construction company, I realize that the story was never really about revenge or vindication. It was about learning to adapt family business principles to the realities of modern industry competition. My grandfather built Reynolds Construction by focusing intensively on quality and customer relationships in a market where those factors determine success. My father expanded the company by adapting to regulatory changes and market growth during an era when careful management was the key to sustainable growth. I built Apex Development Group by embracing strategic acquisitions and operational innovation during a period when industry consolidation required companies to grow or be absorbed by competitors. Each generation faced different challenges and developed different solutions, but the underlying principles remained constant. Build quality projects, treat people fairly, and always deliver what you promise. Everything else is just tactics that have to evolve as business conditions change. The final vindication came not from acquiring Reynolds Construction or building a billion-dollar company, but from creating something that honored my family's legacy while adapting to the opportunities of a new era. Sometimes the best way to preserve tradition is to transform it into something that can survive and thrive in a changing world. And sometimes the people who push you out of one door are actually pushing you toward a much bigger door that you never would have found on your own. 6 years after being escorted out of Reynolds Construction with my belongings in cardboard boxes, I am grateful for the experience. Not because it was pleasant, it wasn't, but because it forced me to discover capabilities and opportunities that I never would have pursued if I'd remained comfortable in the role I'd originally expected to inherit. The construction industry will continue evolving, and Apex Development Group will continue adapting to meet new challenges and opportunities. But the foundation we've built, combining family business values with strategic growth capabilities, should be strong enough to support whatever comes next. After all, we're in the business of building things that last. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.